Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you're watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Imagine standing on the corner of State and Madison in the summer of 1950, watching the world rush past you in a blur of chrome and possibility. The elevated trains thunder overhead, shaking loose flakes of rust that drift down like industrial snow. Below, the sidewalks teem with men in fedoras and women in their finest day dresses, everyone moving with purpose through what they genuinely believed was the greatest city on earth. The air smells of diesel exhaust, hot dogs from the corner vendors, and something else, something metallic and faint that drifts in from the stockyards when the wind shifts south. This is Chicago at its absolute zenith, the city that built America, the place where fortunes were made and futures were forged. But there's something they don't tell you in the history books, something lurking beneath that gleaming surface of prosperity and progress. The 1950s in Chicago was a decade of profound contradictions, where unprecedented wealth existed alongside systematic theft, where the American dream was being manufactured and simultaneously denied to millions, where organized crime didn't just influence the city, but actually ran it through invisible strings of corruption that reached into every courthouse, every police station, every alderman's office. Tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain on the decade that defined modern Chicago, and what we'll find there will change everything you thought you knew about this so-called golden age. The numbers alone were staggering. In 1950, Chicago stood as America's second city, not just in name, but in raw economic power, a manufacturing colossus that produced everything from steel rails to canned meat, from farm equipment to candy bars. The metropolitan area housed nearly 5 million people, making it larger than most entire states. The city's factories worked 3 shifts around the clock, their smokestacks painting the sky in shades of orange and grey, visible proof of industry that never slept. More than 40,000 people worked at the Union Stockyards alone, processing millions of animals every year in an operation so vast it generated its own weather patterns. The steam from the rendering plants would rise and cool, forming clouds that would drift across the south side, a reminder that Chicago's prosperity came with its own peculiar perfume. The loop buzzed with an energy that felt almost electric. Marshall Field's department store on State Street drew shoppers from across the Midwest, its windows dressed with goods that promised transformation through purchase. Inside, women glided past counters stacked with products that would have seemed like pure fantasy just a decade earlier. Electric mixers, automatic washing machines, television sets that brought the world into your living room, the store's walnut room. Restaurants served lunch to business executives, making deals that would reshape entire industries. Nearby, the Board of Trade building stood like a monument to capitalism itself, where men in suits traded grain futures and commodity contracts that would determine the price of bread in Boston and beef in Birmingham. The money flowing through Chicago in those years was simply astronomical. The stockyards represented industrial might at its most raw and uncompromising. At their peak in the early 20s, they had processed more than 18 million head of livestock annually. But even in the 1950s, they remained a massive operation. Workers arrived before dawn, streaming through the limestone gate arch that marked the entrance to what locals called Packing Town. The work was brutal, dangerous, and absolutely necessary for the men who did it. These were immigrants and their sons, black migrants from the South, Mexicans who had crossed the border seeking steady wages. They worked in conditions that would seem unimaginable today, standing on floors slick with blood and fat, wielding knives that could take off a finger in a careless moment. The smell was overwhelming, a combination of living animals, fresh death, and the chemicals used to preserve the meat. But the paychecks were steady, and steady paychecks meant everything in 1950. Yet even as these workers filed into the plants each morning, the very foundations of their industry were beginning to crack. Swift and Company announced in 1952 that it would no longer slaughter hogs in Chicago, claiming the numbers didn't justify the operation. Armor would soon follow. The invention of refrigerated trucks meant that meatpackers no longer needed to ship live animals to a central location. They could slaughter them closer to the farms, in smaller operations with lower overhead, and none of the union wages that Chicago workers had fought decades to secure. The stockyards wouldn't close entirely until 1971, but the writing was already on the wall in the 50s. visible to anyone willing to look. The same process was happening across Chicago's industrial landscape, though few recognized it for what it was, the beginning of a transformation that would hollow out the city's working class. The steel mills of the southeast side told a similar story, though their decline would come more gradually. U.S. Steel's South Works employed tens of thousands, the blast furnaces lighting up the night sky with an orange glow that residents could see for miles. The work was dangerous and backbreaking, but it paid well enough that families could buy homes, own cars, send their kids to Catholic schools where nuns with rulers taught discipline alongside mathematics. The neighborhoods around the mills, South Chicago, South Deering, Hegewisch, hummed with the confidence of communities built on seemingly permanent foundations. On Friday nights, the taverns filled with men whose hands bore the scars of hot metal and hard labor, men who believed their sons would follow them into the mills, that this way of life would continue indefinitely. But in corporate boardrooms, a different conversation was taking place. Company executives looked at maps and spreadsheets, calculating the cost of doing business in Chicago versus the cost of building new facilities elsewhere. Every year, property taxes rose. Environmental regulations began to appear, tentative at first but pointing toward future burdens. Labor unions negotiated contracts that squeezed profit margins. Meanwhile, the South beckoned with its promise of cheaper land, lower wages, and politicians eager to offer tax breaks to any company willing to relocate. The math was simple, even if the human cost was not. The city's leaders celebrated the manufacturing might without understanding that its very success contained the seeds of its transformation. Mayor Martin Kennelly presided over a city that seemed prosperous and stable, though cracks were appearing in that facade for anyone willing to look closely enough. New highways were being planned, the Congress Expressway, which would later be renamed the Eisenhower, slicing through the west side, displacing thousands of residents and dozens of small manufacturers. The planners called it progress, a necessary evolution toward a modern transportation network that would keep Chicago competitive. They didn't calculate the cost in terms of destroyed neighborhoods and shuttered businesses. Or perhaps they did calculate it and simply decided the price was worth paying. The consumer boom of the 1950s transformed daily life in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from our current vantage point. In 1945, most American families owned virtually nothing beyond basic necessities. Radios were common, but televisions were rare luxuries. By 1955, the average middle-class home in Chicago's suburbs contained a television, a refrigerator, an automatic washing machine, a vacuum cleaner, and at least one automobile, often two. This explosion of consumer goods represented a fundamental shift in how Americans thought about their relationship to material possessions. Advertising executives understood this shift and exploited it ruthlessly. Television changed everything. In 1950, only about 10% of Chicago households owned a television set. By 1955, that number had jumped to over 60%. By 1960, nearly every home had one. Families gathered in living rooms to watch programs that shaped their understanding of what normal life should look like. Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver presented an idealized vision of suburban domesticity, white families in spacious homes where problems were solved in 30 minutes, and nobody ever struggled to make rent. The commercials that interrupted these programs sold products, but more importantly, they sold a lifestyle, a vision of prosperity that equated happiness with consumption, success with the accumulation of goods. The automobile represented the ultimate symbol of this new prosperity. In 1950, there were about 40 million registered cars in America. By 1958, that number had nearly doubled. Chicago's streets transformed to accommodate this automotive invasion. The city had been built for pedestrians, for streetcars and elevated trains, but now everything bent toward the needs of private vehicles. Parking lots consumed blocks that once held buildings. Gas stations appeared on every major corner. Drive-in restaurants like the ones popping up along the new expressways promised convenience, the ability to eat a meal without leaving your car. Nobody seemed to notice that this convenience came at the cost of the walkable neighborhoods that had defined urban life for generations. For middle-class white families, particularly those moving to the suburbs, This consumer paradise felt like the culmination of the American promise. After the deprivations of the Depression and the rationing of the war years, abundance felt like a birthright, something earned through sacrifice and now justly rewarded. Young couples married earlier than any generation before or since, driven by both genuine affection and powerful social pressure to conform to expected patterns. They bought homes in developments with names like Park Forest and Deerfield, places where every house looked remarkably similar but offered something previous generations could barely imagine. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a garage, a yard where children could play safely away from city streets. The housewife of the 1950s became an iconic figure, though the reality was far more complex than the image suggests. Yes, women wore dresses and pearls to do their housework, or at least that's what the magazines showed. The truth was more nuanced. Most housewives wore simple house dresses, comfortable but presentable, the kind of clothing that could transition from scrubbing floors to answering the door without embarrassment. They wore girdles and stockings, not because they particularly enjoyed these garments, but because social expectations demanded a certain level of presentation. The work was endless: laundry, cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, all done without the labor-saving devices we take for granted today. Yes, they had washing machines, but these early models required constant supervision. They had vacuum cleaners, but carpets still needed beating. They had refrigerators, but meal planning and preparation remained time-consuming. What made this arrangement particularly insidious was the way it was sold as liberation. During the war, over 60% of married women had worked outside the home, taking factory jobs and clerical positions to support the war effort. They had tasted independence, earned their own money, proven themselves capable of doing work that men had always claimed only they could do. Then the war ended, and suddenly there was an enormous propaganda campaign encouraging women to return to the home. Magazines ran articles about the joy of homemaking. Television shows celebrated the domestic sphere. Psychologists warned that working mothers would damage their children's development. Politicians and business leaders made it clear that men needed those jobs to support their families. Shopping became a form of labor in itself, a way for women to contribute to the family's success through careful consumption. The new suburban shopping centers made this easier, vast parking lots surrounding buildings that housed dozens of stores under one roof. A woman could drive out in the morning, park her car, and spend hours browsing through merchandise, all without dealing with the supposed dangers and inconveniences of the city. These shopping centers were designed explicitly for suburban housewives, with wide aisles for strollers, eating areas where children could be fed, and operating hours that coincided with when husbands would be at work. But here's what they didn't tell you about this gleaming suburban paradise. Here's the part that got left out of the television shows and the magazine articles and the cheerful advertisements. This prosperity, this American dream, was available only to white families, and even then, only to certain kinds of white families. The entire structure of post-war prosperity was built on a foundation of systematic racial exclusion, so complete, so totalizing, that it shaped the geography of American cities in ways we're still dealing with today. Chicago had always been segregated, but the 1950s saw this segregation codified and enforced through mechanisms both legal and violent. The Black Belt, a narrow corridor running south from the Loop along State Street, had contained Chicago's African-American population for decades. By 1950, this area was bursting at the seams. The Great Migration had brought hundreds of thousands of black Southerners to Chicago, people fleeing the terror of Jim Crow for the promise of industrial jobs and relative freedom. They found the jobs, though usually the dirtiest and most dangerous positions. The freedom proved more elusive. Restrictive covenants, legal agreements written into property deeds that prohibited selling homes to black buyers, covered most of Chicago's residential neighborhoods. These covenants had the force of law until the Supreme Court declared them unenforceable in 1948, but that ruling did little to change the reality on the ground. When covenants lost their legal standing, white neighborhoods found other ways to maintain their exclusivity. Real estate agents refused to show homes to black buyers. Banks declined to provide mortgages to black families trying to buy in white neighborhoods. And when these economic barriers failed, violence stepped in to enforce the color line. The housing riots of the 1950s don't get much attention in history books, perhaps because they undermine the narrative of this decade as a time of prosperity and progress. But they happened again and again with terrifying regularity. When black families moved into white neighborhoods, they often faced mobs of thousands, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands of white residents, many of them recent European immigrants or their children, who saw racial integration as an existential threat to their property values and their way of life. In Englewood in 1949, a white mob estimated at 10,000 strong rioted for several nights after a black family attempted to move into an apartment building. The family was eventually forced to leave. The mob was never prosecuted. Cicero, a suburb just beyond Chicago's western border, erupted in violence in 1951 when a black family tried to rent an apartment. The Illinois National Guard had to be called in to restore order. The apartment building was destroyed. Harvey Clark, the black war veteran who had tried to move in, had to flee for his life. His white landlord, who had rented him the apartment, was charged with inciting a riot. Let that sink in for a moment. The person who tried to rent an apartment to a black family was prosecuted for causing violence, while the mob that destroyed property and threatened lives faced no consequences. Even in cases where black families successfully moved into previously white neighborhoods, they lived under siege. Police protection was sometimes provided, but it was temporary and grudging. Banks frequently refused to provide mortgages to subsequent black buyers, creating a catch-22 where integration could only proceed through exploitative arrangements. Vandalism was constant. Broken windows, slashed tires, threatening notes left on doorsteps. Children faced harassment at school. Adults endured hostile stares and occasional violence when they left their homes. This brings us to one of the most destructive practices of the era: contract buying, a scheme so predatory it makes modern subprime lending look generous by comparison. Here's how it worked. Black families, unable to obtain conventional mortgages due to redlining, were desperate to escape the overcrowded conditions of the Black Belt. Speculators recognized this desperation and turned it into profit. They would buy a home in a white neighborhood for, say, $12,000. Then they would sell it to a black family on a contract for $22,000. The black family would make a large down payment, often their entire life savings, then make monthly installments at interest rates far higher than the market rate. But here's the catch: they didn't own the home. They were essentially renting with the promise of ownership at some distant future date, and if they missed a single payment, they could be evicted immediately and lose everything they'd put into the property. The scale of this theft was staggering. Research has shown that contract buying in Chicago cost black families between $3 and $4 billion in today's currency. That's billions with a B, wealth that was systematically extracted from black communities during the 1950s and 1960s. Wealth that could have been passed down to children and grandchildren, wealth that could have funded businesses and education and all the things that build generational prosperity. Instead, it went into the pockets of speculators who exploited legal racism for personal gain. Meanwhile, white families were receiving unprecedented government support for home ownership. The Federal Housing Administration, created during the New Deal, explicitly refused to back mortgages for black families or for white families buying in integrated neighborhoods. The VA provided similar support to veterans, but only white veterans benefited fully from these programs. The result was a massive transfer of wealth to white families, subsidized by the federal government, while black families were systematically excluded from the very programs that created the white middle class. This wasn't an accident or an unfortunate side effect. It was the deliberate policy of the United States government. The psychological impact of this exclusion is difficult to fully measure. Imagine knowing that the reason you can't buy a home in a decent neighborhood has nothing to do with your job or your income or your character. Imagine watching white families, often with less education and lower incomes than you, move into suburban homes while you're trapped, paying inflated rent in an overcrowded apartment. Imagine trying to explain to your children why they can't play in certain parks or swim in certain pools or live on certain streets, not because they've done anything wrong, but simply because of the color of their skin. The anger this generated, the sense of injustice and betrayal, would explode in the 1960s. But in the 1950s it simmered beneath the surface, a constant pressure that everyone could feel but few wanted to acknowledge. White flight accelerated throughout the decade. As soon as a few black families moved into a previously all-white neighborhood, white homeowners would panic and sell at reduced prices. Real estate agents, practicing what was called blockbusting, would deliberately stoke these racial fears to generate commissions from rapid turnover. They would approach white homeowners and warn them that property values were about to plummet, that they needed to sell immediately before it was too late. Then they would turn around and sell those same homes to black families at inflated prices. Both sides got exploited, but in different ways and to different degrees. Entire neighborhoods underwent complete racial transformation in a matter of years. Englewood went from 98% white in 1950 to 98% black by 1970. Austin, South Shore, Chatham all experienced similar transformations. This wasn't integration in any meaningful sense. It was ethnic succession, one group replacing another in a pattern that left everyone worse off. The white families who fled lost the neighborhoods they had known, the churches and schools and corner stores that had anchored their lives. The black families who moved in inherited neighborhoods that banks refused to invest in, where city services deteriorated, where the tax base eroded as businesses followed white customers to the suburbs. The expressways that were built during the 1950s both facilitated and accelerated this process. The Eisenhower, the Dan Ryan, the Kennedy, these massive concrete ribbons that cut through the city's fabric, made it possible for people to live in the suburbs while working downtown. But they also served as physical barriers that reinforced racial boundaries. The Dan Ryan Expressway, completed in the early 60s, was deliberately routed to maintain the separation between black and white neighborhoods on the south side. Robert Moses might have been building expressways in New York, but Chicago's planners learned his lessons well. Now, while all this housing drama was playing out, while families were being displaced and neighborhoods were being transformed, Chicago's cultural scene was undergoing its own revolution, one that would echo far beyond the city's borders. The South Side music scene of the 1950s represented one of the most creative periods in American musical history, the moment when country blues from Mississippi transformed into the electrified Chicago sound that would eventually give birth to rock and roll. The story starts with the Great Migration, the same movement of people that was straining the Black Belt's housing capacity. These migrants brought with them the musical traditions of the Delta, the raw, acoustic blues that had developed on plantations and in juke joints across the rural South. Musicians like Muddy Waters, born McKinley Morganfield in Mississippi, came to Chicago seeking factory work. Waters found a job in a paper mill, but his real calling was music. In the South, he had played acoustic guitar, his voice cutting through the noise of Saturday night parties. In Chicago, surrounded by the constant roar of trains and traffic and industrial machinery, he realized he needed amplification. The electric guitar changed everything. Suddenly blues could compete with the ambient noise of the city. The sound became harder, more aggressive, more urgent. Waters plugged in, hired a band that included Little Walter on harmonica, and started playing in the clubs that lined South Side streets like Maxwell and Madison. The music they created was visceral and raw, sexually charged in ways that made it scandalous and irresistible in equal measure. This wasn't the polished entertainment of downtown nightclubs. This was working-class music, played in working-class venues for audiences who understood exactly what Waters meant when he sang about the struggles and joys of black life in industrial America. Chess Records, run by the Polish immigrant brothers Leonard and Phil Chess, recognized the commercial potential of this new sound. From their studio on South Cottage, Grove, they recorded Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Willie Dixon, Sonny Boy Williamson, creating a catalogue that would influence virtually every rock guitarist who came after. The Chess brothers weren't philanthropists. They paid their artists poorly and retained rights that should have belonged to the musicians themselves. But they had an ear for talent and a willingness to record music that major labels dismissed as too raw, too black, too dangerous for white audiences. The clubs themselves were something to behold. Teresa's Lounge on Indiana Avenue became legendary, a place where Coco Taylor would shake her wang-dang doodle all night long, where audiences packed in so tight you could barely move, where the music was so loud it shook the windows. These weren't fancy places. Many of them were just taverns with a small stage in the corner, but they hosted some of the most innovative music being created anywhere in America. Jazz thrived alongside blues. The Blue Note on Madison Street was downtown's premier jazz club, where Billie Holiday and Mildred Bailey performed for integrated audiences. Jazz Limited on East Grand focused on instrumental groups, showcasing the technical virtuosity that bebop demanded. The Beehive Lounge on 55th and Harper became a landmark, its name later adopted by a record label that would continue promoting innovative jazz for decades. But here's the complexity that rarely gets discussed. As blues and jazz developed in black communities, white audiences became increasingly interested, particularly younger white people who found the music more exciting than anything being offered by mainstream pop. This created economic opportunities for black musicians, but it also created new forms of exploitation. White rock and rollers like Elvis Presley and the Rolling Stones would later make fortunes playing music they had learned from Chicago blues artists who died broke. Chess Records recognized this dynamic and tried to navigate it, recording both black blues artists and white rock performers. But the structural inequalities meant that black innovation constantly generated white profit. The music scene also intersected with Chicago's organized crime in ways both obvious and subtle. Many clubs were owned by or paid protection money to the outfit, Chicago's term for its mafia organization. This created a strange dynamic where the same people who enforced racial boundaries in housing also profited from black culture. A white gangster might refuse to let black families move onto his block, then spend his evenings at a Southside club enjoying the music those same families created. The contradiction apparently troubled no one. Speaking of the outfit, it's time to talk about the invisible empire that actually ran Chicago during the 1950s. The organized crime structure that controlled everything from garbage collection to judicial appointments, from union leadership to police assignments. The Chicago outfit of the 1950s represented organized crime at its most sophisticated and most insidious, a criminal organization that had evolved far beyond the crude violence of the Capone era into something that looked almost legitimate from the outside. Tony Accardo, known as Joe Batters, served as the outfit's boss, though he officially took a semi-retired status in 1957. Paul Ricker, the waiter, was the other half of Chicago's criminal leadership. Unlike Capone, who had courted publicity and ended up in prison, Accardo and Ricker understood that the best way to run a criminal empire was to remain invisible. They lived in nice houses in respectable neighborhoods. They paid their taxes, or at least enough of them to avoid scrutiny. They maintained the appearance of being legitimate businessmen, semi-retired entrepreneurs who had made their money in vague ventures that nobody examined too closely. But beneath this respectable facade operated a criminal organization of stunning scope and sophistication. The outfit controlled most illegal gambling in Chicago, from horse racing books to policy wheels, the numbers game that flourished in black and immigrant neighborhoods. These weren't street corner operations. This was organized gambling on an industrial scale, generating millions of dollars annually. The profits were laundered through legitimate businesses, used to fund additional criminal enterprises, and paid out in carefully structured payments that avoided tax consequences. Labor unions represented another profit center. The outfit had infiltrated major unions, particularly the Teamsters, through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and the strategic placement of loyal members in key positions. Control over unions meant control over entire industries. If you needed trucks to move goods, you dealt with outfit-controlled trucking. If you needed construction work done, you hired outfit-approved contractors. If you wanted labor peace, you paid the right people. Businessmen who resisted found themselves facing strikes, or worse. Political corruption was perhaps the outfit's greatest achievement. The First Ward, which covered most of downtown Chicago, was controlled by Pat Marcy, a made member of the outfit who operated out of an office in the Democratic Party headquarters. Marcy had the power to fix court cases, influence judicial appointments, and ensure that police investigations ended without charges. He controlled this power through a network of corrupt judges, cooperative prosecutors, and police officers on the outfit payroll. The system was so entrenched that honest cops who tried to buck it found themselves reassigned to meaningless positions or forced out entirely. The Hollywood extortion scheme of the 1940s showed the outfit's reach extending far beyond Chicago. Johnny Rosselli, operating on orders from Nitti and Rika, had infiltrated the Projectionists' Union and the Theatre Janitors' Union, both essential to movie exhibition. The outfit killed the leaders of these unions and took them over, then used the threat of strikes to extort money from movie studios. The scheme generated enormous profits until federal investigators finally caught on. Nitti killed himself rather than return to prison. Rika went to prison but continued to run the outfit from behind bars. What made the outfit so effective was its understanding that corruption had to be systematic, not occasional. You couldn't just bribe a cop when you needed him to look the other way. You had to have cops on permanent retainer, officers who understood that their real paychecks came from the outfit, not the city. You couldn't just fix an occasional court case. You had to control enough judges that you could be certain of favorable rulings. The outfit invested in corruption the way legitimate businesses invest in infrastructure, viewing it as a necessary cost of doing business. The average Chicagoan knew about all this, at least in general terms. Everyone understood that certain politicians were corrupt, that certain judges could be bought, that the outfit ran gambling and controlled unions. But there was a strange acceptance of it all, a sense that this was just how things worked in Chicago. As long as the trains ran and the garbage got collected, and your own life wasn't directly affected, you didn't make waves. The few people who did try to fight corruption found themselves alone, unsupported by a public that had grown cynical about the possibility of change. By the mid-1950s, federal investigators were beginning to take a serious interest in the outfit's operations. The Kefauver Committee hearings had exposed organized crime as a national problem, though the committee's focus on the mafia as an alien conspiracy missed the point. Organized crime in Chicago wasn't imposed by foreigners. It grew organically out of American capitalism, out of political corruption, out of the gap between laws and enforcement. It was as American as apple pie, and just as deeply embedded in the culture. Daily life for ordinary Chicagoans unfolded in the shadow of all these larger forces, though most people were far more concerned with immediate concerns than with grand historical trends. The morning routine started early for families across the city and suburbs. Men caught trains or drove cars to work, flooding into the loop where office buildings held the insurance companies, banks and corporate headquarters that employed hundreds of thousands. Factory workers punched time clocks, changed into work clothes, and took their positions on assembly lines or in foundries or at loading docks. The housewife's day began even earlier. Children needed to be dressed and fed and sent off to school. Breakfast dishes had to be washed. Beds had to be made. The television might go on, filling the empty house with the cheerful voices of morning programs that offered cooking tips and household advice. Tuesday was laundry day in many households, a full-day affair even with automatic washers. Clothes had to be sorted, washed, hung to dry, or placed in the dryer, a luxury that was becoming more common but still not universal. Then came the ironing, shirts and dresses and sheets, everything pressed smooth with a steaming iron that was far heavier and more difficult to manage than modern models. Shopping was a major undertaking. Without freezers large enough to hold more than a few days' worth of food, women shopped several times a week. Local grocers in the city offered delivery service and maintained credit accounts for regular customers. In the suburbs, supermarkets were replacing corner stores, vast spaces where you pushed a cart through aisles stocked with an ever-growing array of products. These supermarkets represented a fundamental change in how Americans bought food, trading the personal relationship with a local grocer for lower prices and greater selection. Meal preparation consumed hours each day. Convenience foods were starting to appear, TV dinners in their aluminum trays, instant cake mixes that supposedly made baking easier, frozen vegetables that saved the time of peeling and chopping. But these were supplements to cooking from scratch, not replacements. A proper dinner still meant meat and potatoes, vegetables, bread and dessert, all prepared that afternoon. Cookbooks from the era revealed both the aspirations and the limitations of 50s cuisine. Casseroles made from cream soups, salads suspended in gelatin, recipes that prioritized convenience over flavor, but still required significant labor. The evening meal brought the family together, or at least that was the ideal promoted by magazines and television. Father would return from work, expecting to find a clean house and a hot dinner. Mother would have spent the afternoon preparing. Children would do their homework or play outside until called in for dinner. Everyone would gather around the table for a meal that might last 30 minutes or an hour, depending on the family's habits and how much conversation occurred. After dinner, the television went on, and families arranged themselves in the living room to watch whatever programming the three networks offered. Television viewing was a different experience than it would later become. There were only 3 channels: ABC, CBS, and NBC. Programming started in the late afternoon with children's shows, moved to family sitcoms in the evening, and ended with the late news around 10 or 11. What you watched was determined by what was on, not by personal choice from an array of options. This created a shared culture, millions of people watching the same programs, discussing them the next day at work or school, referencing jokes that everyone understood because everyone had seen the same episodes. Saturday was for chores and errands. Lawns needed mowing in the summer, leaves needed raking in the fall, snow needed shoveling in the winter, the car needed washing. Home improvement projects beckoned from lists that never seemed to get shorter. For children, Saturday morning meant cartoons, a solid block of programming that held kids captive while parents slept late or caught up on household tasks. Saturday afternoon might mean a trip to a department store or hardware store, parents dragging bored children through aisles of merchandise. Sunday meant church for many families, though church attendance was as much about social conformity as religious devotion. Catholics attended Mass, often at enormous parishes that served ethnic neighbourhoods, Polish or Irish or Italian communities, where the church anchored social life. Protestants filled churches across the city and suburbs, denominations organising themselves along class and racial lines. After church came Sunday dinner, often the week's most elaborate meal, sometimes shared with extended family. The afternoons stretched out lazily, devoted to reading the newspaper, listening to the radio, maybe driving somewhere for an outing. Leisure activities were more constrained than they would later become, but they existed. Drive-in theatres dotted the suburban landscape, offering entertainment where families could watch movies from the comfort of their cars. Regular movie theatres still flourished, showing films that represented Hollywood at its height, productions that had budgets and production values television couldn't match. Bowling alleys experienced a boom, becoming social centres where leagues competed on weeknight evenings. Recreation programs offered activities for children, keeping them occupied during summer months when school was out. For teenagers, the 1950s represented a particular kind of purgatory. Old enough to understand the world's constraints, but too young to escape them, adolescents navigated a social landscape that offered little autonomy. Dating proceeded according to rigid scripts, boys asking girls to dances or movies, couples going steady by exchanging class rings, everyone aware that sexual experimentation beyond kissing could result in pregnancy and social ruin. Rock and roll music, filtering up from the South and exploding into mainstream consciousness, offered a form of rebellion that terrified parents precisely because it worked. Elvis Presley's hip movements seemed dangerous because they were, dangerous to the careful control that 50s culture tried to maintain over young people's sexuality. The public face that people presented was meticulously maintained. Men wore suits, or at least sport coats to work, casual dress being reserved for manual labour. Women dressed up for shopping trips, viewing it as a point of pride never to appear in public looking dishevelled. Children were expected to be neat and polite, to show respect to adults, to avoid causing embarrassment. This pressure to maintain appearances created a culture where problems remained hidden, where families struggled privately with issues that everyone knew existed, but nobody discussed openly. Mental illness was stigmatized, to a degree difficult to imagine today. Depression meant weakness. Anxiety was nervousness. Serious conditions resulted in institutionalization, often in state hospitals where conditions were appalling and treatment was minimal. Alcoholism was common, particularly among men, but it was viewed as a character flaw rather than a disease. Women who couldn't cope with the demands of housekeeping and child-rearing were prescribed tranquilizers, the famous mother's little helpers that turned addiction into a middle-class epidemic. Domestic violence remained largely invisible. The police rarely intervened in family matters, viewing a man's treatment of his wife and children as essentially his own business. Women who left abusive husbands faced enormous social and economic consequences, losing access to their children, their homes, their social standing. So most stayed, trying to manage the situation, hoping it would improve, protecting their children as best they could. Yet for all these problems, for all the dysfunction that lurked behind closed doors, the 1950s did offer a degree of economic security that seems almost unimaginable today. A man with a high school diploma could get a factory job that paid well enough to support a family, buy a home, and build a modest middle-class life. The gap between rich and poor was narrower than it had been in decades or would become in later years. Union membership was at its peak, ensuring that working-class people had some leverage against corporate power. Social Security and other New Deal programs provided a safety net that hadn't existed for previous generations. This security was built on a specific set of circumstances that were already starting to erode, even as people celebrated their achievement. American manufacturing dominated global markets because Europe and Japan were still recovering from wartime devastation. Unions were strong because companies hadn't yet figured out how to move operations overseas or to right-to-work states. The social safety net existed because there was broad political consensus that unregulated capitalism had nearly destroyed the country during the Depression. All of these conditions were temporary, though nobody knew it at the time. The seeds of future crisis were being planted throughout the decade. Urban renewal projects demolished neighborhoods in the name of progress, displacing poor and working-class communities to make way for highways and high-rise housing projects. These projects would become symbols of policy failure within a generation, but in the 1950s they were celebrated as solutions to urban blight. The Cabrini Green Homes, which would later become synonymous with poverty and violence, opened in the mid-50s as modern housing that offered indoor plumbing and steam heat to families who had been living in cold water tenements. The public housing being built during this era was explicitly designed to maintain racial segregation. The Chicago Housing Authority, under pressure from white aldermen and residents, built projects in neighborhoods that were already black or in areas that were transitioning. This ensured that public housing would concentrate poverty rather than disperse it, creating conditions that would contribute to the catastrophic problems of later decades. Meanwhile, suburban development continued to exclude black families through both legal mechanisms and informal agreements, ensuring that the benefits of federally subsidized housing went exclusively to whites. Puerto Rican migrants began arriving in Chicago during the 1950s, seeking the same opportunities that had drawn earlier immigrants and black Southerners. They settled primarily in Lincoln Park, in a neighborhood that was then one of the city's poorest. The work they found was hard and poorly paid, but it was better than what they had left behind on the island. They established community organizations, opened businesses, built churches. Their children attended schools where teachers often didn't speak Spanish and had little interest in learning about Puerto Rican culture. The Young Lords would emerge from this community in the 1960s, originally as a street gang formed for protection against hostile white gangs, later transforming into a political organization fighting gentrification and police brutality. But in the 1950s, the Puerto Rican community was still getting established, still figuring out how to navigate a city that viewed them as foreign, even though they were American citizens. Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans faced similar challenges. They worked in the stockyards, in steel mills, in factories across the city. They lived in neighborhoods like Pilsen and Little Village, areas where Spanish was the dominant language on the streets. Like other immigrant groups before them, they maintained cultural traditions while adapting to American life, creating a hybrid culture that was neither fully Mexican nor fully American, but something distinct. The Catholic Church played an enormous role in immigrant and ethnic communities. Parishes organized themselves along national lines, each serving a specific group. Polish parishes conducted Mass in Polish, Italian parishes in Italian. These churches were more than religious institutions. They were community centers, social service organizations, and political power bases all rolled into one. The parish school educated children in religious values, alongside academic subjects. The church basement hosted dances, bingo games, and community meetings. The priest wielded enormous influence, his approval or disapproval shaping families' decisions on everything from marriages to mortgages. Working-class neighbourhoods maintained a rich social life that revolved around local institutions. The corner tavern was where men gathered after work, where political discussions happened, where you learned about job openings and measured the neighbourhood's mood. The local park district offered swimming pools and baseball diamonds where kids played organised sports under the supervision of coaches who taught teamwork and discipline. The neighbourhood movie theatre showed films for a quarter, attracting crowds on weekend afternoons. These institutions created a fabric of community that would fray as people moved to suburbs and the middle class grew more geographically dispersed. Street life was vibrant in city neighbourhoods. Children played in streets and alleys, their games changing with the seasons. Stickball in summer, where a broomstick and a rubber ball substituted for baseball equipment. Skating on frozen alleys in winter. Kick the can and hide and seek in the evenings, when parents would call children home as darkness fell. This street life created a form of supervision where everyone watched everyone else's kids, where you couldn't get away with mischief because some neighbour would tell your parents before you got home. The corner store was a neighbourhood institution, a small shop where you could buy groceries on credit if you were a regular customer, where the proprietor knew your family and asked about your grandmother's health. These stores couldn't compete with supermarkets on price or selection, but they offered convenience and personal service that the chains couldn't match. You could send your child to the corner store with a note, and the owner would fill the order and put it on your account. This credit system served as a form of social safety net, allowing families to get through rough patches when money was tight. Youth culture was changing in ways that alarmed parents. Rock and roll represented something genuinely new, a musical form that spoke to teenagers' experiences in ways that adult music didn't. Parents heard the sexual energy in the music and worried, correctly, that it was encouraging their children to think about things parents preferred they ignore for a few more years. The moral panic around juvenile delinquency reflected these anxieties, with newspapers running stories about teenage gangs and out-of-control youth, even though most teenagers were just as conformist as any previous generation. High schools enforced strict rules about dress and behaviour. Boys couldn't have long hair, girls couldn't wear pants. Skirt length was monitored. Couples caught kissing faced detention or suspension. These rules were designed to maintain order and respectability, but they created a sense of constant surveillance that some students chafed against. The gap between the public conformity enforced by schools and the private rebellion of teenage culture would widen in the 1960s, but the tension already existed in the 50s. College was becoming more accessible thanks to the GI Bill and the expansion of public universities, but it remained far from universal. Most high school graduates went directly to work, boys into factories or offices, girls into clerical positions or marriage. College was for the elite and the ambitious, for young people whose families could afford tuition or who qualified for the limited scholarships available. Even then, higher education was primarily a white privilege, with black students facing discrimination in admissions and exclusion from most fraternal organizations and social activities. The Korean War cast a shadow over the decade that's often forgotten now. Young men faced the draft, the possibility of being sent to fight in a conflict that seemed distant and confusing to many Americans. The war ended in 1953, but military service remained a reality for young men through the rest of the decade. This created a particular psychology, where teenage boys knew they might have to spend 2 years in the military, an awareness that shaped their life planning and their sense of what the future held. Civil defense drills were a regular part of school life, a reminder that nuclear war was considered a genuine possibility. Students practiced duck and cover, crouching under desks in the absurd belief that this would protect them from atomic bombs. The federal government encouraged families to build fallout shelters, stockpiling food and water against the day when Soviet missiles might rain down on American cities. This background anxiety, the understanding that the world could end at any moment, influenced 50s culture in ways both obvious and subtle. The scientific optimism of the era existed alongside this nuclear anxiety. Americans believed that science and technology would solve every problem, that the future would be a gleaming world of jetpacks and flying cars and cities on the moon. The space race was just beginning, with Sputnik launching in 1957 and shocking Americans who had assumed their technological superiority was unquestionable. The response was a massive investment in science education and research, a determination to beat the Soviets that would eventually put Americans on the moon. But while Americans were looking up at the stars, they were often blind to the problems in their own streets and neighborhoods. The prosperity that the middle class enjoyed had been purchased at a price that was only beginning to become visible. The environmental cost of all that industrial production would become clear in later decades, when the rivers caught fire and the air became unbreathable, and the extent of pollution became impossible to ignore. The social cost of segregation and exclusion would explode in the riots of the 60s, when the patience of black communities finally ran out. The pattern of urban disinvestment that began in the 50s would accelerate in the 60s and 70s, creating the so-called inner city as a distinct zone of poverty and despair. The white ethnic neighborhoods that had thrived in the 50s would empty out as their residents moved to the suburbs or farther out to places like Arizona and Florida. The factories that had employed hundreds of thousands would close, their buildings standing, empty or demolished, their workers forced to find new careers in service industries that paid far less. The union power that had secured middle-class wages would erode as companies moved operations overseas or to right-to-work states where unions couldn't organize effectively. The housing wealth that white families accumulated during the 50s would compound over generations, passing to children and grandchildren, funding college educations and business startups and down payments on homes. Black families, systematically excluded from this wealth-building process, would remain generations behind in accumulated assets, a gap that persists to this day. The contract-buying schemes of the 50s helped create the vast racial wealth gap that shapes American society in the 21st century. The organized crime that flourished in the 50s would eventually face serious law enforcement pressure, though it never went away entirely. The outfit adapted to changing conditions, moving from crude extortion to more sophisticated financial crimes, from street-level gambling to casino operations in Las Vegas, and eventually to white-collar fraud. The political corruption that sustained organized crime would prove harder to eliminate, since it was woven into the fabric of how Chicago did business. The music created on Chicago's South Side in the 50s would travel around the world, inspiring musicians who transformed it into rock and roll and eventually into virtually every form of popular music that followed. British bands like the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin would pay explicit tribute to Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, though they would make far more money from this music than its creators ever did. Black musicians who died broke would be celebrated posthumously, inducted into halls of fame, honored with plaques and markers at clubs that had long since closed or been demolished. The television culture that developed in the 50s would shape American society for generations. The shared experience of watching the same programs, of referencing the same cultural touchstones, would create a kind of national unity that would fragment as cable and internet offered infinite choices. The advertising techniques perfected in 50s television would become ever more sophisticated, learning to manipulate desire in ways that would have stunned the relatively crude pitchmen of the early years. The suburban experiment launched in the 50s would transform American geography, creating sprawling metropolitan regions where people lived 20 or 30 or 40 miles from where they worked. The environmental cost of this development pattern, the endless driving, the destruction of farmland and forest, the segregation by income and race would become clear only slowly. The social cost, the isolation and disconnection that suburbia fostered would fuel movements in later decades to create more walkable, mixed-use communities. The gender roles so carefully enforced in the 50s would explode in the 60s and 70s as women rebelled against the limitations imposed on them. The feminine mystique, as Betty Friedan would name it, the idea that women should find complete fulfillment in housework and child-rearing, would be revealed as a lie that left millions of women frustrated and angry. The women's liberation movement would grow from this frustration, demanding not just legal equality, but a fundamental reorganization of how society thought about gender and work and family. The contradictions of the 1950s are what make the decade so fascinating and so troubling. This was a time of genuine prosperity, when ordinary people could achieve a middle-class life without college degrees or family connections. But that prosperity was built on exclusion and exploitation, on a system that systematically denied opportunities to anyone who wasn't white and male. It was a time of supposed social conformity, when everyone was expected to follow the same script, play the same roles. But beneath that conformist surface bubbled rebellion and rage, forces that would explode in the next decade. The American dream promised in the 1950s was real for those who were allowed to claim it, but the price of that dream was paid by people who were excluded, who watched others prosper while they struggled, who understood that the system was rigged but had few tools to fight back. The civil rights movement would grow from this understanding, as would the other liberation movements that defined the 60s and 70s. So what should we make of this decade now, from our vantage point nearly 3/4 of a century later? The lesson isn't that the 50s were uniformly terrible or uniformly good. The lesson is more complex and more important. The lesson is that prosperity built on exclusion is fragile and unstable, that societies that deny opportunities to large segments of their population are storing up trouble for the future, that the costs of injustice eventually have to be paid. The lesson is that the gleaming surfaces we see in historical photographs often hide enormous cruelty and suffering. The smiling faces in those images of suburban families, those well-dressed shoppers on State Street, those workers filing into factories, all of that was real, but so was the violence in Cicero, the contract-buying schemes in Lawndale, the police brutality in black neighborhoods, the organized crime that corrupted every level of government. The lesson is that the choices we make about how to structure our society have consequences that last for generations. The decision to build expressways through black neighborhoods, the decision to exclude African Americans from federal housing programs, the decision to allow contract-buying schemes to operate openly, all of these choices shape the geography of inequality that we still inhabit today. The lesson is that culture and politics and economics are inseparable, that you can't understand the music without understanding the housing discrimination, can't appreciate the prosperity without acknowledging the exploitation, can't celebrate the American dream without mourning all the people who were systematically denied access to it. The 1950s in Chicago was a decade of astonishing creativity and devastating injustice, of genuine progress and profound moral failure. It was a time when the city stood at its peak of power and influence, when Chicago's decisions rippled across the nation, and it was a time when those decisions laid the groundwork for decades of struggle that would follow. The city that emerged from the 1950s was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it, more segregated, more suburban, more automobile-dependent, more politically corrupt, more divided by race and class. The manufacturing base that had seemed so permanent was already beginning to erode. The neighborhoods that had seemed stable were already starting to transform. The culture that had seemed so conformist was already breeding rebellion. Understanding this decade means understanding that history is never simply about the past. It's about how the past shapes the present, how choices made decades ago continue to influence the world we live in today. The racial wealth gap, the geographic segregation, the political corruption, the decline of urban manufacturing, all of these contemporary issues have roots in the 1950s, in decisions made by people who probably didn't fully understand the long-term consequences of their actions. But lack of understanding doesn't equal lack of responsibility. The people who enforced segregation, who profited from contract buying, who ran organized crime networks, who built expressways through black neighborhoods, they made choices that served their interests at the expense of others. They knew what they were doing, even if they didn't know how it would all turn out. And the people who benefited from these systems, the white families who bought homes with federally backed mortgages, who moved to suburbs that excluded black families, who got jobs in industries where unions fought to keep out black workers, they benefited whether they actively supported segregation or simply went along with it. The prosperity they achieved was built on a foundation of racial exclusion, and that foundation remains visible in the wealth they passed to their children and grandchildren. The music, though, the music was something different. The blues and jazz created in Chicago during the 50s represented a form of resistance, a claim to dignity and artistic worth that couldn't be denied, even by people who denied black humanity in every other context. That music endures, outlasting the housing projects and the factories, outlasting the clubs where it was first played, speaking across generations and cultures in ways that the architects of segregation could never have imagined. If there's hope in this story, it lies in understanding that change is possible, that systems that seem permanent and inevitable are actually quite fragile, that ordinary people acting collectively can transform their world. The civil rights movement that would shake America in the 60s grew from the frustrations and experiences of the 50s, from people who had been told to wait and decided they had waited long enough. As you drift off to sleep tonight, thinking about Chicago in the 1950s, remember that every historical era is complicated, that simple narratives of progress or decline never capture the full truth. Remember that prosperity and suffering coexisted, that the American dream was real for some and denied to others, that the gleaming surface of post-war affluence concealed rot and injustice. Remember that the choices we make today about how to structure our society, who to include and who to exclude, how to distribute resources and opportunities, these choices will echo into the future just as the choices of the 50s echo into our present. The question is whether we'll learn from the mistakes of that era or repeat them in new forms. Chicago in the 1950s was a city of enormous potential and profound failure, a place where the best and worst of American capitalism played out on streets that still bear the marks of that decade. Understanding this history doesn't change what happened, but it might change how we think about where we are now and where we want to go. If you enjoyed this deep dive into 1950s Chicago, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what other cities and decades you'd like to explore. Sleep well, and remember that history is never as simple as it seems.